go. Great. And let me go over and share my screen. One moment. Okay, it looks like we're live on YouTube. And now we're going to go over and share my screen and we'll get started. All right, so I should be in the corner, and I want to make sure that my audio is, my audio looks good. And you should see on my screen what we're going to be talking about. So I wanted to start with a few announcements and last minute thoughts. Why adiponectin is important, really honing in on why fat is not just sitting there, that it's really an endocrine organ, meaning it's releasing hormones, adiponectin being one of them, and trying to understand the balance of fat and its impact on your overall body, the functions, diseases associated with it, and more importantly, the diet and lifestyle suggestions that are going to make this healthy. Now, I know this sounds kind of nutty in the sense that it sounds like this is going to be a topic that is going to be overly scientific. Maybe that's sort of how you might be feeling, but please bear with me as we jump into it. All right, so a couple first announcements. So first of all, I've mentioned the Body Mastery Method. This is a program, a 3-month program that I believe that I put my heart and soul into, that is basically a way of giving you an incredible amount of control over your health in terms of habits, understanding nutrition and longevity, optimizing your metabolism. And we have 7 people ready to start the program. We're looking for 3 more people, 3 more coachable people, I would say, who are willing to support others and basically start on really a new health path, one that you can sort of customize for yourself with my guidance. What you get with this is 5 days of food each month for 3 months. We spoke about the benefits of biological fasting and how that's effective at getting rid of what's called visceral fat, the fat around the organs. You'll understand why that's important. You get body composition machinery that we track with you, food journal software and analysis, office hours, 12 weeks of classes, and support and customized guidance. I have to say that one of the things I like to do so much is to review what's called my chronometer account, which I use for my patients, and that is food tracking software. And it's amazing what you can learn by getting sort of a second opinion on really what you're eating, how you're eating, that sort of thing. And if you're interested in all of these things and want to be one of the remaining 3 people, definitely contact me. Go to chatwithdrcarp.com and set up a call, and we can talk about it. Before I start, I just wanted to make a comment about something that occurred to me earlier today, and that is that I really believe, and this really comes from my food journal analysis, looking at people's food journals, and I often feel like it's very common for me to be able to see the general mood of a person based on the food that they're eating, whether they're whether they're rushed or stressed. I can see shortcuts being taken and a general lack of care in terms of your overall health, even though it might not look all that bad. Looking at all these food journals, you can sort of get this, and when you get to understand your patient, you really start to realize that the way you prepare your food is often reflective of how you're feeling towards yourself. And unfortunately, in North America, especially, we've lost traditional sensibilities and cues around food. In other words, if any of you have traveled to Italy and to France, just as an example, or pretty much any traditional society, but there's something special about France and Italy in the sense of the celebration of food and the care of food and the love of food and the social connectedness of food. All of these things that go into making a meal and enjoying a meal in Italy and France, and of course other countries as well. But certainly there's something magical about how food is enjoyed and prepared in France and in Italy. Now, we've lost that in the United States for the most part. We rush through our meals. We don't have the social connectedness of our food and families as has been cultivated over generations of cultures and such. And we've also lost the cues to understand how food is supposed to be enjoyed, when sort of the end of a meal is supposed to be finished. I've spoken about this before. Certain studies have showed that Americans have lost certain cues in terms of feeling full, as an example, to when to stop. And I think we are in danger of losing a very primary connected feeling towards the food that we eat. And I think that if you think about how a mother is making a special meal for her children, you can start to regain, or at least understand, the love and care that goes into a meal. But ultimately, when you make food for yourself, you should show care for yourself. I mean, you're made in the image of God, so you should show yourself some love. And unfortunately, when I review many food journals, I often see that there is a lack of caring for yourself in the food that people prepare. So I would just urge all of you, especially when it comes to making, say, a very delicious salad, as an example, by chopping different vegetables, using different things. Show yourself some love, show yourself some care in the kitchen. And ultimately, sometimes you need to break the mindset of what you're doing at the moment. I'm guilty of this. Sometimes I'm having a very busy day, and I just rush into the kitchen to make myself, maybe a quick salad. And ultimately, if you can just break the mindset and get in there and prepare your food with love and care, the meal is going to be so much better for you. So break the mindset. Don't take your current mindset into the kitchen. Take a walk outside, make a sharp delineation and a sharp separation between what you were doing before and what you're doing in the kitchen. So maybe it's music, maybe it's jumping around dancing, maybe it's taking a walk outside. But I just want to focus you in on how important it is to show yourself care when it comes to preparing your food. It's so important. Think of it as a act of love for yourself, an act of healing for yourself. Every meal can be a healing meal. And that's the best way to sort of change your mindset in that regard. Something that just occurred to me earlier today. Okay, so references for tonight's class. People have been asking for me to post references. This article was sent to me by an algorithm from a medical website that I put in some of the things that I'm interested in, came across this article. I thought it was just fabulous, and we're going to be talking about some of the highlights of that, as well as Nutrition Genome, which is the company that I use to do all my nutrigenomic analyses. People will send in their genetics, and then I'll look at their genetics to determine if there are any genetic things that will help in terms of understanding diet. There are certain, some people, as an example, their blood sugar goes up more than others with saturated fat, or saturated fats associated with more weight gain, or there's a type 2 diabetes. There's a gene that's associated with people who actually aren't that obese that have diabetes. And for those people, they should avoid grains more than others. So there's lots of things you can learn about that. But there is also a gene that makes adiponectin artificially low. And we'll talk about that as we go through tonight's class. So why is adiponectin important? So let's jump right into it. So here are some factoids about adiponectin. Adiponectin, first of all, is released by your fat cells. Remember, what I spoke about at the beginning, briefly, talking about how fat's not just sitting there, it's metabolically active. And people who have low adiponectin levels have 3 times greater risk of developing metabolic syndrome. So that's unbelievable. Individuals with low levels of adiponectin are up to 9 times as likely to develop type 2 diabetes. Wow. And if their adiponectin levels are high, they're not going to get metabolic syndrome as much. Metabolic syndrome, which we've spoken about before, is associated with sort of this constellation of high triglycerides. Many of you have gotten that on your blood tests, abdominal obesity, high blood pressure, high blood sugar, high cholesterol, all these sort of combining together to really cause not just shortened lifespan, but a whole host of other medical problems unfortunately. And this is a severe problem in North America these days. Individuals with low adiponectin have 2 times the increased prevalence of cardiovascular or coronary artery disease. And adiponectin levels in the blood actually are increased by some of the diabetes medications. And as always, if anyone has any questions about references, here are some other references. You can always contact me and I can forward you the references I used. So let's talk a little bit about the fat as an endocrine organ. So we spoke about it, right? I spoke about how one of the most important things I've tried to communicate over the last 58 weeks is to understand that the fat on your body is not just sitting there. It's a metabolically active organ that is essentially churning out all kinds of inflammatory particles. And when something is released from fat, it's often called an adipokine. And so this is, you might have heard the term cytokine, which is a chemical that's released from immune cells to sort of recruit other immune cells. And this is released from the fat to show that it's basically something that's actively released. So there are lots of things that are released from fat. There's adiponectin, there's leptin, there's other inflammatory factors. We've spoken about these just as general inflammatory markers. So, and these are associated with decreased longevity and increased aging. And so adiponectin is one of these. Leptin is also one. You may have heard about this, as leptin is supposed to regulate your appetite so that it gets to a point where, it almost tells your brain that you have a certain amount of fat, and therefore it's supposed to downregulate your hunger so that you don't eat as much. But unfortunately, what we're finding is that when people have a certain amount of excess fat, it looks like they get leptin resistance. In other words, their brain is actually not reading the leptin signals, the signals to lower your intake of food, to modulate your hunger, in other words, to make you less, have less hunger, in other words. And if your brain is not receiving the signal because it's resistant to the leptin, that's going to lead to a problem where not only are you gaining weight, but that you are not getting the signal to stop eating. And so this is part of the reason why it's often very, very difficult for people to lose weight, because once this leptin resistance occurs, unfortunately, you're not getting the natural signal in your body to sort of stop eating. And the first and foremost, obviously, by the end of this talk, not only are you going to understand factors that are related to adiponectin, but quite frankly, if you are dealing with adiponectin correctly from a lifestyle perspective, and we'll talk about what kind of foods and supplements and lifestyle decisions you should be making, that will also be helping your leptin. Leptin resistance is going to get better when you lower your triglycerides, when you improve your sleep, and we'll get back to these later on when we get to the real practical suggestions, because they're also important when it comes to adiponectin. So we're getting this general context of fat, understanding why the fat that you have on your body is going to be a problem for various different factors, that it's just not sitting there. And many of you know, I've spoken about it many times, that the fat that surrounds your organs is associated with the most inflammation. It's 3 times more metabolically active than the fat that you have, just around your arms, or, the ones that you can sort of pinch. The one that is surrounding your organs is really associated with an enormous amount of inflammation. And as we've said before, fasting and doing biological fasting, like I recommend for all my patients, is one way of getting rid of that. But by the end of tonight's class, you're also going to understand other various strategies to be able to help with that, which basically comes into this notion that there is what by one author describes as you get to a point where you have sort of dysfunctional adipose tissue. Now think about it as an endocrine organ. In other words, what's another endocrine organ? Well, thyroid is another endocrine organ. That's one analogy. So it's almost as if, think about it from a thyroid perspective. You have a dysfunctional thyroid. Well, what's happening here is you have a dysfunctional organ, adipose tissue organ, adipose being fat. So in other words, you're getting the hormones being released, just like, your hormones could be all out of whack from your thyroid. The same thing can happen in your fat when it comes to when you get to a certain point that you have a lot of fat. And one of the markers that people are starting to look at is this ratio between adiponectin and leptin. We've spoken about leptin just a little bit. You have a general understanding about that and how it affects your overall hunger. Well, of course, we're going to get into that. And just like, again, thinking about just as a analogy, thinking about thyroid, you're getting all these unusual ratios in the sense that you now have a endocrine hormone problem going on when you have a lot of excess fat. And just as an example, this also correlates with your BMI. This is an indicator of insulin resistance. So all of these things are basically coming together into a metabolically active sort of dysfunction. Now, when I talk about metabolism, I'm talking about how you're metabolizing sugar and dealing with insulin and using fatty acids. That's sort of what I mean by metabolism. And of course, we spoke about metabolic syndrome being associated with all those things that we spoke about, with obesity and high cholesterol and high blood sugar and high blood pressure. So you can see all of these chronic problems that we're all dealing with these days are all sort of coming together, and everything is pointing in the same direction, that we need to correct our metabolism, and we need to correct the abnormal hormones that are associated with having excess fat. And that's basically what we're going to be speaking about now. Let's close this down and move on. So let's go through some of the functions of adiponectin so you can see how remarkably diverse it is in terms of its effects, and how, remember, one of the principles of understanding what a endocrine organ is that it's releasing a hormone that's having an effect at a distant site. So when you have sex hormones released, they are obviously, released essentially from the brain and are affecting, your genitals and your general hormone levels affecting other, testosterone, as an example, is going to affect your muscles, it's going to affect your libido, it's going to affect, obviously, your sexual functioning. Well, the same thing that we can think about here. We have this fat, it releases these hormones, one of which is adiponectin, and it's going to have an effect on your brain, your liver, your muscle, your heart, your kidneys. So again, we're pushing forward the idea that you start thinking about the fat as an endocrine organ. In the brain, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and is able to cause you to have more insulin sensitivity. Remember, with type 2 diabetes that we've spoken about before, that there's insulin resistance. And anytime you can reverse insulin resistance or increase insulin sensitivity, in other words, your ability to use insulin, that is always going to be a much healthier situation. It's also going to affect your overall energy homeostasis. And neuronal plasticity as well, which is basically your ability of your brain to adapt, to learn, and to be healthy. It's a general indicator of brain health. So you really want to dial that in. Now, your liver is really fundamental when it comes to metabolic health. And in this case, it's helping to control blood sugar as well as lipid metabolism. And it also is reducing fat accumulation. So it can help with fatty liver as well as general fat accumulation. And this is done through something called AMPK, which is going to come up from time to time. And I am going to not go into it just this moment, but I will in a second, because it's going to be very important. And we've spoken about it multiple times. And I sort of feel like, as we go week to week, it's important for me to repeat certain concepts just so they really get embedded into your brain. It reduces levels of insulin in the blood. Again, that's always going to be beneficial. We've spoken about before how raising insulin levels, unfortunately, is going to be associated with higher cancer rates. And it's just generally associated. Insulin is basically like a growth hormone in addition to its use for getting blood sugar into the cells. And we don't want to have our body in this growth state, because If it's associated with a growth state, then there's an association with growing things like cancers that you don't really want. So anything that's going to reduce your levels of insulin is going to be beneficial. High levels of carbohydrate, highly processed carbohydrates, and even animal protein can increase insulin levels. Now, adiponectin is capable of reducing these. And again, it's all going to come down to what are the lifestyle and diet suggestions that are going to reduce this. In muscle, same thing. It's going to increase insulin sensitivity, increase fatty acid oxidation, so your ability to process fat. It helps with the uptake of glucose, and that AMP activation again, which I'll speak about again in just a second. Protects the heart by increasing fatty acid oxidation. In other words, it's protecting the heart by allowing the heart to be able to use fatty acids as energy, and also protects the kidneys as well. So because I've mentioned AMPK, I'd like to spend just a quick moment talking about that because it's quite important. And it's known as the master switch. In other words, it's basically the energy regulator of the cell. Now, the mitochondria, which it increases, mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So we have something that you could think of as the master, the circuit breaker in your house. If there was one circuit breaker in your house, the AMPK would basically be that master circuit breaker switch, turns everything on. Now, the mitochondria is basically the powerhouse of the cell. And remarkably, when your AMPK goes up, you're actually able to increase the numbers of mitochondria. And it's always good. It increases your metabolic health when you're able to increase the numbers of mitochondria in your cell, because you're going to be more energy efficient if you have more little powerhouses in your cells. You're not going to have mitochondrial problems. In other words, if you just have one or two power plants for a city, I mean, they're going to be incredibly stressed. But if you have many power plants powering a city, then you are going to be healthier in terms of thinking about it from a metabolic perspective. Targets inflammatory fat, increases fat burning, and as we said, regulates just general energy metabolism by turning things on and off. It's modifiable by metformin. We've spoken about that before. A lot of people are on metformin for type 2 diabetes. Gynostema T, and there's some supplements like bilberry and hesperidin from orange peels. There's a supplement from the Life Extension Foundation called AMPK Activator, which is a very good supplement. And fasting as well is going to help upregulate AMPK. In addition to, now we know, getting your adiponectin level up. So just to simplify what we've now spoken about, just to summarize it, is we now understand that just like any other endocrine organ, like the thyroid, it's releasing chemicals, releasing hormones that are having an effect at a distant site around your body. Just so happens that adiponectin, as a fat hormone that's released, is going to be affecting all of these different things. But it just so happens, right, that we're seeing that it's having an incredible impact on your metabolic machinery, your ability to process sugar in a healthy way and fat. So it's increasing insulin sensitivity, it's helping process fat, it's lowering your insulin levels. All of these things are going to provide a beneficial profile to your overall health, your overall metabolic health. And that's why it's incredibly important. Now, if we look at it from a disease perspective, then we can look at it from various different things. We can look at it from a diabetic perspective. Now, it makes sense. We probably already know now what it's going to say here, right? We've spoken about how it increases insulin sensitivity, lowers insulin levels. So it's obvious that we're going to understand that. So insulin sensitivity, increased fat metabolism, again, all of these things are associated with high levels of adiponectin, and lower levels, of course, are actually associated with higher levels. So the higher the level, the better you are doing. And how is it working? Most likely through, again, that AMPK activation. And I usually drink during this class that Gynostema tea. It's one of my favorites. I ran out of it, but anyway, cancer levels decreased in several types of cancer, and that sort of makes sense, doesn't it? We spoke about how these high insulin levels are going to predispose people to higher rates of cancer. That may not be the direct association, but it should point to this understanding of how your metabolism is not just associated with the use of energy, but also going to increase your risk for various other things associated with invasive breast cancer, low levels associated with increased risk of uterine cancer. In that case, these are not necessarily talking about a direct causative effect, but an association. We know that it crosses the blood-brain barrier and affects the energy metabolism of the brain. And again, it would make sense. You know, my father used to think years ago that Alzheimer's disease was a type of diabetes of the brain, and some people call it sort of type 3 diabetes. So it does make sense, shouldn't it, that when we're dealing with a problem of insulin sensitivity, that there are going to be some additional risk factors for Alzheimer's disease. So reduction in levels promotes progression. It's a risk factor in women. In other words, low levels of adiponectin are seen higher in women with Alzheimer's, and the protective effects in the brain that we spoke about may be protective. Cardiovascular disease, again, higher levels associated with reduction, and low levels increased risk of hypertension and cardiomyopathy in diabetic patients. All of these things really coming back all the way to the top, where we spoke about metabolic syndrome, that constellation of triglycerides, obesity, high blood pressure, hypertension, blood sugar, cholesterol, etc., all coming back to really, hopefully, you seeing how important it is to get your metabolic system, your metabolic health into a reasonable way. I put in the gene Adipo-Q. There's a certain mutation on a gene that some people have that makes them more predisposed to having a lower level of adiponectin. And it's associated with increased heart disease and possibly colon cancer in certain populations. But ultimately, the most important thing to remember is this famous quote that I was trying to find who did it. There's actually who made it. There's some confusion about who did it, but we all use it all the time. The genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. So no matter what genes you have, no matter how bad they are, with the exception of some very, very rare diseases, generally speaking, just because you have the gene does not mean that that's your destiny. Genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And by environment, we mean not just our external environment, but the food that we eat and our overall lifestyle as well. So even though Ashkenazi Jewish populations and Chinese populations who have insulin resistance and have this gene are at an increased risk for heart disease and colon cancer, that is not, it doesn't mean you're going to get it if you get everything else right. If you follow all the lifestyle suggestions, you're able to get your adiponectin level up and reduce the risk. And the same thing goes with just about every genetic mutation that's out there, with the exception, again, of a few conditions that very, very few conditions that you can't do much about. Okay, so let's move on to diet and lifestyle. A lot to talk about there. And I think all of us, let's start with what lowers it. I think all of us probably have a general indication of what this is. Obviously, having diabetes, having obesity, of course, is going to do that. If you're metabolically unhealthy, higher levels of meat are going to cause it to go down. And it's considered that this decline in obesity is associated with oxidative stress. In other words, it's alteration of gene expression. So one thing to keep in mind, that one of the most amazing things that I've seen was I went to a lecture by a doctor by the name of Dean Ornish, who did a very famous study that showed that he could reverse heart disease by a certain type of, it was a low-fat vegan diet along with yoga and relaxation and these sorts of things. It really was the first person to show reduction of plaque in arteries of the heart. He was subsequently doing some studies on prostate cancer, and he was able to show, with one of the most profound slides I'd ever seen in a medical lecture, which is basically showing how diet and diet alone was able to turn on and turn off genes. In other words, when people were eating an unhealthy diet, you could actually see the genes turn from what he would made them turn red, as if they were turned on in a negative way. And then when they switched their diet, those genes were basically those cancer genes were turned off, and anti-cancer genes were turned on. So again, we always have to remember that phrase, that genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. Because for many years, let's be honest, that every generation of medicine goes through this sort of idea, this overall idea, so where that sort of captures everyone's attention. And early, in the 1900s, of course, last century, it was the era of infectious disease when penicillin came about, and the life expectancy went up, and there was excitement in medicine that we were able to get control of this remarkably damaging and life-shortening thing called infections. And there was, it was like everything, all of medicine was focused on infectious disease. And at some point in time, within, starting around the 80s, 90s, when the genome was finally finished, they were able to transcribe the genome. Everyone thought that we had basically entered the era of genetics. And everyone thought at that time that we've solved human health. We've decoded the human genome. Well, it turns out that it's not that simple. In fact, it's far from simple. There are genetic code. There's strings of genetic code that we don't even know what they're doing. It used to be that we thought it was sort of junk code, but we're finding out that sort of junk code is not junk at all, that it's doing all kinds of things that we haven't delineated yet. And as we've spoken about so far, this concept of epigenetics, which is being able to modify genetic expression in yourself by environmental influences, throws a whole bit of, it just makes things a lot more complicated, but also it's empowering in the sense that if we get our environment and our mental state and our diet all dialed in, we're able to create a favorable genetic expression for health. Our bodies will respond genetically by turning on genes that want to keep you around. And that to me is miraculous. It's like our bodies, a lot of people say, that our food is like information, and it's information that our genes read and say, okay, you could almost, anthropomorphize, your own body by the messages that you're sending. In other words, you are eating all, healthy, wonderful, delicious, salads with all kinds of different phytonutrients, and your genes are basically seeing that and saying, oh, this guy wants to stick around a few more years. Okay, we're going to turn on our favorable, genes, and we're going to turn off these other genes. And unfortunately, when we eat processed foods and all kinds of negative things, we stress ourselves and we don't sleep. Same thing, your body looks at that and it's information. You're communicating to your genes and it's saying, this guy, I don't know about this guy, but I don't think he wants to stick around here much longer. So turns on pro-cancer genes, turns on inflammation, that then turns on, other sorts of things. So you get oxidative, as we say here, the oxidative stress of, not sleeping, overly stressed, processed foods, this oxidative stress, this stress on the body is changing genes that's causing a decline in adiponectin. So it's starting there, going to adiponectin. And then now we know that adiponectin is associated with all these other things. So it really means a lot for you to show care, as I said, started from the very beginning, show care for yourself by giving your genes the information and, quite frankly, show yourself the love of appreciating the wonderful, incredible bounty of vegetables that we're able to get, increase the diversity of the foods that you're eating, take care, and realize that each meal is both medicinal and healing. All of these things are so important when we try to take just scientific concepts and then bring them over into your overall life by thinking about them, emotionally. I mean, honestly, the truth is that I can talk. I could give a lecture from now and for probably for the next, 48 hours straight talking about all this stuff. But unless there is some sort of emotional connection to the information that I'm giving you, ultimately the results are not going to, be that important. So all I can say is that your body is geared to being cared for and given the information that's going to promote positive gene expression. Um, all I'm doing with all these lectures is giving you, again, a different lens to look at through so that you can see how important this is, from a scientific perspective, and to a point where you don't have any doubt that you understand the decisions you need to make to optimize your health. That's really the goal here. So anyway, let's talk about what raises adiponectin. And there are lots of things. Of course, the Mediterranean diet, which is a complicated one in the sense that no one's really defined what a Mediterranean diet is, but ultimately we sort of have a general conception of what that is. Lean meats, fish, a wide variety of different plants, olive oil, these sorts of things. But generally speaking, Mediterranean diet's going to help. In monounsaturated fats, as opposed to saturated fats in people who are diabetic, adequate levels of fish oil are important for that. So one of those studies, one of those blood tests that I recommend as the top 7 blood tests, you can go back to my lecture on the 7 blood tests that you should know your levels on. One of them is the omega-3 index. I think it's very important. And it's also associated with lower triglycerides. Now, we're bringing everything together now. When many people have a very favorable response to triglycerides when they take omega-3 fatty acids. So for a lot of people who have high triglycerides and are falling into that constellation of metabolic syndrome, omega-3s can be really powerful. And one of the reasons why is this connection with adiponectin. When you lose weight, your adiponectin level goes up, focusing on low glycemic food index, so foods that don't spike your blood sugar. There was a study on Japanese men in Japan that said that the more deep yellow vegetables they ate, I actually pulled the article and I couldn't find which deep yellow vegetables, but honestly, the point is that obviously if you're eating a large variety of pigmented leafy greens and vegetables, all that's going to be beneficial for your glycemic index, for your weight loss, and a whole host of things that we've spoken about probably ad nauseum, and how important it is for you to eat the most number of a diverse amount of plant foods that are healthy. Pterostilbene, found in mulberries, blueberries, cranberries, raw almonds. All of these can raise your adiponectin level. Tularecide, found in rose hips, so rose hip tea, strawberries, raspberries, so berries are important. And remember now, the amazing thing about berries in general is that, they actually don't have that much sugar in it. I think like strawberries are, a whole bunch of strawberries have very, very little sugar. Same with cranberries, of course, blueberries. Of course, you can overeat these, but you should always just think of a serving size when you're eating these things. A handful of raw almonds per day is certainly something I recommend, or a handful of any raw nuts per day. They're great. Berberine, capsaicin. In breast cancer patients, they were able to show that ginger, a certain amount of ginger, as well as exercise, was able to have an impact on adiponectin levels. Curcumin, turmeric, which is the active ingredient in turmeric, is going to be going to be helpful as well. And of course, this has come up as an anti-inflammatory herb, spice, I should say. So all of these things are coming together. I hope you're starting to see how all of these things that are repeating. I've spoken about berries just about probably 20 times over the last 58 weeks and how important they are for various different things in terms of improving your gut microbiome. The pigments can affect that. Blueberries are also high in fiber, as are all these berries, as is raw almonds. So again, I'm hoping that you see how much benefit you can get from including as many varieties of different types of plant products and why they're affecting you in so many different ways. In this clinical endocrinology article I found, melatonin supplementation was also associated with a 7.2% reduction in body fat percentage, which is pretty impressive. And those who received melatonin additionally experienced a 2.6 increase in lean mass and a 21% increase in adiponectin compared to the placebo. That's amazing. And think about what we do to ourselves. What are the signals we do to ourselves when we don't sleep well? Our melatonin levels are all messed up when we don't sleep well, or when we're staring in front of a computer screen right before we go to sleep. The blue light from the computer screen is having an enormous impact on your melatonin. In other words, when you buy those lights that are LED lights, they are releasing an enormous amount of blue light. And what happens naturally in your body is that if we go back, when we didn't have all this light, this artificial light, the sun would go down. And just when the sun goes down, our melatonin starts to increase, getting our body ready to shift into the next phase of sleep. And what's going to happen if you're disrupting melatonin in this case? Well, obviously, it's going to be associated with an increase in your body fat. It's going to lower your adiponectin. And so you want to make sure that you have the natural level of melatonin. And how do you do that? You pay attention to light. One way is to switch back from LED lights to the incandescent bulbs that we used to have in our houses. In the Obama administration, they actually banned incandescent bulbs, and then the Trump administration turned over that ban, and now you can buy old-fashioned incandescent bulbs. If you do that, that's going to help your melatonin levels. And I recommend, actually, if you have lamps that you lead to that you're using the new LEDs, well, they are more energy efficient, but at what cost? At the cost of affecting a very natural body, which is melatonin. Now, obviously, this is saying you can reverse all that with melatonin supplementation, but obviously, what I would say to this, and that is that, yeah, you can try to do some melatonin supplementation, and there probably is, for many people, a reason to do melatonin supplementation. However, you always want to try to duplicate nature as much as you possibly can. So being cautious of looking at your phone or turning on the blue light on your phone, watching TV right before you go to sleep, standing under blue lights. You can buy, blue light blocker sunglasses to help if you're having trouble sleeping. All of these are going to preserve the natural benefit that melatonin has in your body. Melatonin is really a remarkable substance that I'm learning more and more about as time goes by. Okay, so let's review some of the things that we've spoken about tonight, and then we'll go to our, let me check the time, and then we'll go to our little quiz, which we always have at the end of the class. And let me zoom out here. Okay, so we've spoken tonight about a whole host of things. Excuse all my digressions in terms of food preparation, but let's talk a little bit about adiponectin. We spoke quite a bit about how the risks, are incredibly high. Remember that 9 times. Individuals with low levels are up to 9 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. We reviewed metabolic syndrome and why it's so important to get a handle on that, thinking about those triglycerides and high blood pressure, high blood sugar. and realizing that the solution to all of these problems, you start to get an understanding of how they have so much in common, getting rid of them. We spoke about how to think about fat releasing chemicals in your body that are affecting all kinds of other distant sites around your body. That's so important for you to understand and to realize that there's a very delicate balance, and that when we have too much fat on our body, we have a dysfunctional endocrine organ, just like a thyroid can have a whole bunch of messed up hormones. And it's critical for us, metabolically speaking, in terms of how we process sugar and fat, to get that in order. We spoke about how it's affecting all these distant sites, and how it makes sense that due to insulin sensitivity and general insulin levels and the effects that it has on the brain and blood sugar, all of these things are going to be affected. We spoke about how you can have a gene, and there are people who have this gene. I've certainly done genetic reviews where people have this. But as always, remember, it's so important to remember, genes load the gun, but environment pulls the trigger. And then we spoke about what lowers it, which made sense because we spoke about all those things that are no good for us. And then we spoke about all the plants and the effect of potentially why fish oil is beneficial, and rounded that out. So let's go over to let me stop sharing my screen here. And now I'm back in, you can see Miami Beach, which is where I live. And let me share my screen I see we have more people who came in. Welcome, everyone. Didn't see you enter. Let me share my, see if I can find it here. 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Let me just go over to my, okay. Let me move things around a little bit here. And okay, so I think you can see my screen, and let me go to tests, adiponectin, and we're going to start the test. Let's see here. Let's just go to preview test, and then let's blow the screen up a little bit. And let's start. Okay. So what is associated, and let me pull up my chat box. Okay. Let's see here, chat. Okay. So what is associated with low levels of adiponectin? Metabolic syndrome, cardiovascular disease, obesity, all of the above. Helen is always the first. Correct. And we spoke about metabolic syndrome. You all now know what metabolic syndrome is. The constellation of high cholesterol, high triglycerides, increased abdominal obesity, hypertension, high blood sugar. Individuals with low levels of adiponectin are how much more likely to develop type 2 diabetes? They 2 times, 4 times, 9 times. Amazingly, 9 times. So when people have low levels of adiponectin, they're 9 times more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. And Dave, the answer to your question is yes. Fat is not an organ. It's an endocrine organ, or it just sits there. Of course, it's an endocrine organ, and it's so important to understand that so that we have a better understanding of it. What does adiponectin do? Increase insulin sensitivity, upregulates AMPK, reduces fat accumulation, reduces insulin sensitivity. Oh, okay. So it increases insulin sensitivity. It actually, I made this, I think when I started doing this question, I was going to do which one of the following doesn't include that. So it increases insulin sensitivity. it upregulates AMPK, it reduces fat accumulation, but doesn't reduce insulin sensitivity. So we're just going to skip that question. Oh, it's telling me I have to answer, but I made a mistake on that one. Okay, what is AMPK known as? The master switch, the powerhouse of the cell, the genetic trigger. Correct, AMPK. And what is the powerhouse of the cell? Can anyone type that into the chat box? Right, it is the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's correct. Genetics loads the gun, but the environment does what? Pulls the trigger, correct. Okay, very good. So important to understand that, because quite frankly, one of the things that just drives me absolutely bonkers is when you have a doctor who is considered to be an expert say that your disease is, it's genetic, the cause is genetic. Well, while you might have genetic markers that may predispose you to that condition, and you can't necessarily say that until you fix your entire environment. And if you fix your entire environment, almost every genetic issue, again, there are exceptions to the rule, can be mitigated. So that's so important to understand. Which of the following is not associated with higher levels of adiponectin along with diabetes? So increasing insulin sensitivity, better fat metabolism, insulin resistance, AMPK activation. So that's correct, insulin resistance. So let's go over that. So adiponectin, higher levels of adiponectin are going to be better. So you're going to increase insulin sensitivity, of course. You're going to have better fat metabolism, but insulin resistance, that's going to be associated with lower levels, because that's going to be associated with, remember, lower levels of adiponectin is 9 times the risk of type 2 diabetes. And then we spoke about AMPK activation and how important that is. And which supplement is probably most associated with better adiponectin values? Berberine, fish oil, curcumin, capsaicin. Which one of these? And that is, that's correct, fish oil. Of course, all of these have been shown to help. Capsaicin actually is not a supplement. It's from the red pepper plant. It's what makes things spicy. And apparently capsaicin in one study was people who were eating capsaicin, hot red peppers, actually had better adiponectin values, interestingly. And then of course one could put melatonin in here, but again, that was only one study that I saw. Nonetheless, I thought it was pretty remarkable. Okay, so that is it. We're gonna finish that. I'm gonna stop sharing. And I wanted to thank everyone. I'm so pleased that every week we have more and more people joining, which is always exciting for me. And next week, I think we're going to be talking about specifically about cardiovascular risk and some of the increases in cardiovascular risk. In other words, it was up until there was a continual decrease for many, many years of cardiovascular disease. And at some point, I think in the late 80s or in the 90s, started, or maybe even more recent, the trend started to increase again. And talk about that more specifically and what you can do about that. Again, thank you everyone for your attention. I hope you enjoyed tonight's class. And again, thanks to everyone who made comments last week when I attempted to do something a little bit different, and got some great comments. And wish everyone well, and look forward to seeing you next Wednesday night for Wednesday Night Live. Again, if anyone has any questions, you always can reach out to me on my Facebook page, or just respond to the email that invited you to tonight's class. And if you're interested in being one of the 3 people that want to join the Body Mastery Method that we're starting next month, probably starting in the 1st or 2nd week of May, which is coming up very soon, go to chatwithdrcarp.com. We can have a little talk and see if it's something that would benefit you. All right. Good night, everyone. Stay well, and I'll see you